The night sky above the city shimmered with the lights of luxury, and in the middle of that brightness stood a mansion so grand that people stopped just to stare. Its marble pillars shone like silver under the moon, and its wide glass windows glowed with golden light. Inside, laughter and music echoed through the massive halls. Servants moved like shadows carrying trays of wine and food. It was another of Mr. Howard's famous parties. Everyone who was someone wanted to be there. The air smelled of expensive perfume, roasted meat, and pride. Mr. Howard, the millionaire himself, stood near the piano, wearing his tailored black suit, his smile wide and confident, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. He loved to talk about his success, his cars, his travels, and most of all his mansion. He believed everything he owned showed how superior he was. Even the piano behind him, a grand, shining instrument worth more than most people's homes, was there only for show. He never played it, never even touched it, but he liked people to see it and admire his taste. The guests whispered compliments, laughed at his jokes, and filled their glasses again and again. Chandeliers sparkled above them, throwing light across the marble floor like stars. Everything looked perfect. But behind that beauty, there was someone who didn't belong to that world. A man dressed in a simple gray uniform, moving quietly along the edges of the room. His name was Daniel. He was the caretaker, the one who cleaned, fixed, and kept the mansion alive when everyone else slept. Daniel's hands were rough from years of hard work, but his eyes, deep and calm, had a strange sadness in them. As he walked past the grand piano, he slowed for a second. His fingers brushed against the polished wood. It was almost like greeting an old friend. For a moment, his eyes softened, and memories came rushing back of his small childhood room, of his mother smiling as she guided his hands over piano keys, her voice gentle, saying, "Music isn't sound, Daniel. It's emotion." But that was long ago. Before life took a cruel turn, now he was just a caretaker, invisible to everyone in the room. He returned to his work, cleaning spilled wine and picking up used napkins. The laughter around him grew louder. Some of the rich guests didn't even look at him as they walked by. A few made jokes about how servants were lucky to breathe the same air. Daniel smiled politely and said nothing. He was used to this. He had learned that silence was easier than pride. Mr. Howard's voice boomed again, calling for attention. "Everyone, look at this masterpiece," he said, tapping the piano proudly. "It's a limited edition, handcrafted. Imported, mine worth a fortune." People clapped just because they thought they should. One woman asked if he could play something, but Howard laughed, saying, "Oh no, I only buy pianos. I don't waste time playing them." The crowd chuckled. Daniel looked down, but deep inside something in him hurt. The music from the hired band started again, but the sound felt empty to Daniel, artificial, soulless. He had once dreamed of becoming a pianist, of performing in front of audiences, not cleaning after them. As he passed by the piano again, his heart ached with an old familiar longing. He could almost hear the melody he once composed for his mother. Soft, warm, full of love. He wanted to play just once, just to remember who he really was, but he knew if he even touched the keys, he could be fired. As the night went on, the mansion became louder, glasses broke, laughter turned wild and still. Daniel worked quietly, fixing what others ruined. He looked small in that world of gold and pride, but there was something noble in his silence, something that no one there could understand. When the guests finally started to leave, Daniel stood near the piano for one last moment. The lights were dimming, and he could see his own reflection on the piano's glossy surface. It was tired, older than he remembered, but still alive. He whispered softly, "One day, maybe," before turning away behind him. The piano sat silent, waiting. The night outside was cold, and Daniel walked through the empty hall, his footsteps echoing. He didn't know that soon. That same piano would change everything. The world would know his name again, and the mansion that once made him feel small would witness his greatness. But for now, he was only the caretaker, and the world saw nothing special in him. Yet inside him, the music still lived, quietly, patiently, like a flame hidden in ashes. The next evening, the mansion glowed again with golden light. Another celebration, another night of showing off wealth and power. Guests poured in, laughing loudly. The sound of expensive shoes echoed on marble floors, and Mr. Howard stood near the piano once more, waving his hand as if commanding attention. His voice filled the room like thunder. He loved moments like this, moments where he could feel untouchable. He glanced at Daniel, the quiet caretaker who stood near the far wall, polishing a crystal vase carefully. Invisible like always, a famous model laughed, asking playfully, "Mr. Howard, "Can you play that piano, or is it only decoration?" Her voice carried across the room, and a few guests chuckled. Howard smiled, brushing off the teasing. "Play it? My dear, that's an Italian masterpiece worth more than your entire apartment." Everyone laughed harder. Even though it wasn't funny, their laughter felt forced, sharp and cruel. Daniel kept his eyes down, pretending not to hear, but inside he felt something stir. A small ache, a quiet memory of music that once belonged to him. Howard noticed the caretaker's brief glance toward the piano and smirked. "Hey, Daniel," he said loudly. The crowd turned toward the corner where the caretaker stood. "You like my piano, don't you?" The guests laughed softly. Daniel froze, unsure what to say. "Come on," Howard continued, his voice filled with mockery. "You look at it every night as if you could play it. Tell me, can you?" Daniel swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. "No, sir," he said softly. "I just think it's beautiful." But his quiet tone only gave the crowd more reason to laugh. Howard grinned, enjoying their attention. "Beautiful, yes, but not for everyone. My friend," he said, "this piano isn't for janitors, it's for artists. For people who matter." The guests clapped again, as if it was a joke worth cheering, but then a young woman near the front, Elena, the guest who always seemed calm, elegant, and intelligent, tilted her head. "You know, I believe everyone deserves a chance to show what they can do," she said softly. "Why not let him play? If he can't, no harm done." The crowd turned toward her. Curious, Howard laughed loudly. "Oh, no, that would ruin the evening. Imagine this man scratching my piano," he said, shaking his head dramatically. Elena smiled faintly, her tone playful but sharp. "Then maybe you're afraid he might play better than you." The room fell quiet for a second. Howard blinked, surprised, then forced a laugh. "Afraid hardly. Fine, let's make it interesting." He turned back to Daniel, eyes gleaming. "If you can play that piano, I'll marry you myself." The room erupted in laughter. Glasses clinked. Someone shouted, "Go on, caretaker, impress the boss." Daniel felt his heart pounding in his chest. The words hung heavy in the air. He looked at Howard, then at the shining piano, his throat dry. He shook his head. "Sir, I don't wish to play." But Howard waved his hand. "Of course you don't, because you can't," he said, his grin widening. "Don't worry, no shame in being ordinary." Another wave of laughter, cruel and loud, filled the air. Daniel's face burned. His chest tight with humiliation, he forced a small smile and whispered, "Excuse me," before stepping away. Heading toward the back hall, Elena watched him go, her eyes filled with pity and anger. She turned toward Howard and said, "Sometimes you mock what you don't understand." Howard ignored her, already refilling his glass. "It's just a bit of fun," he said casually. "People like him need to know their place." In the quiet of the hallway, Daniel leaned against the wall, his breath shaky, the noise of laughter fading behind him. He stared down at his hands. The same hands that once created melodies that made people cry. Those same fingers now carried dust and stains, he whispered. "One day I'll be free of this silence," but then he smiled sadly, knowing dreams didn't belong to men like him anymore. Later that night, when the party ended, Daniel stayed behind as usual, cleaning up broken glass and empty bottles. The grand hall was finally silent again. The piano gleamed under the soft light, the same piano that had witnessed his humiliation. He stared at it for a long moment. Something in him wanted to run his fingers across the keys, to remind himself who he used to be. He took a slow step forward, his heart beating faster. The room felt alive, as if the walls themselves were waiting. He touched the edge of the piano gently, and in that moment, it felt like touching part of his own soul. "What harm is one song?" he whispered to himself, and as his fingers hovered above the keys, a soft sound escaped, a note pure, fragile, and haunting. The first note led to another, then another, and before he knew it, his hands began to move naturally, beautifully. The melody rose in the air like something alive, the empty mansion filled with music, the kind that carried tears, hope, and memory. Daniel closed his eyes, and the caretaker became the artist again, unaware that someone was standing in the doorway, listening in silence, her eyes wide with disbelief, her heart trembling at the beauty of what she heard. Elena had come back for her purse, and found a miracle instead. Daniel's fingers danced over the keys like they had never stopped playing. The music came alive, not from memory, but from his soul. The sound filled the empty hall like sunlight breaking through old dust, soft at first, then bold, then sorrowful. It was the kind of melody that didn't just reach ears. It reached hearts. Each note told a story of loss, love, and forgotten dreams. He played with his eyes closed, feeling every vibration. The mansion that once felt cold and cruel now felt alive. His music echoed off the golden walls through the tall corridors. It reached the farthest rooms where silence had reigned for too long. His hands moved without thought. Without fear, every movement was pure instinct, pure emotion. At the doorway, Elena stood frozen. The purse she came back for slipped from her hand. Her eyes glistened. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The caretaker, this quiet, humble man, was playing like a master. No, not just a master. Like someone who had lived 1,000 lives through music. His fingers struck every key with grace, like a whisper and a storm at the same time. Elena's heart pounded. She whispered, "My God," and took a slow step forward. Daniel didn't notice her. Lost in the world he had built through sound. The melody changed suddenly, softer, gentler. A lullaby his mother used to play when he was a child. He remembered her voice, her smile, the warmth of a small room and the smell of rain outside. He remembered the first piano his mother ever owned. Old and cracked, but she loved it more than life. She taught him everything she knew, she used to say. Music is the only thing that can make pain beautiful. And even now, those words guided him. Each note was a tear turned into light. He played until his chest hurt, until his heart felt light again. Then he stopped, breathing hard. His hands trembling slightly over the keys. The room was silent again. Only the faint hum of the chandelier remained. He opened his eyes and saw Elena standing there, tears in her eyes, her lips parted in awe. He froze, embarrassed. I'm sorry," he stammered. "I shouldn't have touched it. Please don't tell Mr. Howard." But Elena shook her head, slowly walking toward him, her voice soft but firm. "Don't apologize," she said. "You didn't play that piano. You made it speak." Her words made him blink in surprise. "You're gifted, truly gifted," she continued. "Who taught you to play like that?" Daniel looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. "My mother," he said. "She was a music teacher. We used to play together every evening, but after she passed, I stopped. Life became too heavy and I had to work, the music." He hesitated. The music went quiet. Elena's expression softened. She sat beside him on the piano bench. "You never lost it," she said gently. "You've just been waiting for someone to listen." Daniel gave a small smile, one filled with both pain and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "But people like me don't get heard. We clean floors so others can dance on them." She shook her head. "No, people like you make the world beautiful and don't even realize it." Her eyes drifted to the piano keys. "Play again," she said. "Please, just once more." Daniel hesitated. "I might lose my job if anyone finds out." But she smiled. "Then let's make it worth losing." Something in her voice made him believe again, and so he placed his fingers back on the keys. This time the melody was brighter, like hope reborn. Elena sat there silently, eyes closed, letting the music carry her away. It felt like time had stopped, like the universe was holding its breath when he finished. The silence that followed was deep and full. Elena exhaled slowly. "You could fill concert halls," she said softly. "Do you even know what you have?" Daniel laughed quietly, shaking his head. "Once, maybe," he said. "But that life is gone." She leaned forward slightly. "Maybe not," she whispered. "You think people like Mr. Howard are great because they have money?" "No, true greatness is when someone can touch souls without saying a word. And that's what you did." Daniel looked at her, not sure what to say. Her words were strange, but they warmed something in him that had been frozen for years. Before leaving, Elena placed her hand gently on the piano. "You have a gift, Daniel," she said softly. "Don't let the dust of this place bury it again." And with that, she turned and walked out of the hall, her heels clicking softly on the marble, leaving him alone once more. Daniel sat there for a long time, staring at the piano, his reflection glimmering on its smooth black surface. He whispered to himself, maybe it's not too late." And in that empty mansion where laughter once mocked him, a spark of purpose returned to his heart. He smiled faintly, not because someone finally heard his music, but because he finally remembered who he was. The next morning came quietly, the sun slipping through the tall glass windows of the mansion, painting the marble floor with lines of gold. Daniel moved through the silent halls with his usual calm steps, broom in hand, but something inside him had changed. The night before still echoed in his heart. Those melodies still whispered in his mind. And every time he remembered Elena's words, a small spark of warmth spread through him. She had seen him, truly seen him, not as a caretaker, not as a servant, but as a man who once had music in his soul. He kept telling himself it was just a moment, a small mistake, a secret between them. But his heart refused to forget. As he cleaned the piano's surface again, his hand trembled slightly. He could almost hear the faint echo of the song he had played. The air still held its memory. Soft and invisible, he smiled quietly to himself, not knowing that his secret was already beginning to spread. Later that day, as Howard's guests began to arrive for lunch, Elena returned to the mansion, her calm expression hiding a storm of excitement. She had spent the night thinking about what she heard. She couldn't get Daniel's music out of her mind. It wasn't just skills, it was emotion, rare, pure, and real. She had called a few close friends in the art and music world and whispered, "I've found something incredible." They thought she was exaggerating, but she convinced them to come that evening, to see for themselves. Inside, Mr. Howard was in his usual mood, laughing loudly, boasting about his wealth, telling stories no one dared to interrupt. Elena walked in gracefully, greeting him with a polite smile. "Howard," she said softly, "I was thinking tonight's dinner could use something different, something artistic." He raised an eyebrow, curious. "What are you planning, my dear?" She smiled mysteriously. "You'll see, but promise me one thing, no interruptions." Howard laughed. "You always bring surprises. Fine, I'll play along," he said, not realizing just how much this one would cost his pride. Daniel, meanwhile, worked quietly in the background. Unaware of any of this, he kept his head low as he served drinks and polished glasses, but he couldn't ignore Elena's gaze from across the room. She looked at him like someone who knew a secret, and it made his heart race when the evening came, and the guests gathered in the grand hall. She walked over to him and whispered, "Tonight, you'll play again." Daniel froze. His heart stopped for a moment. "No," he said quickly. "I can't, I'll lose my job." "Please don't do this," but her eyes were calm, steady. "Trust me," she said. "Let the world hear what I heard." Before he could argue more, Howard's voice echoed across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, our lovely Elena has prepared a little entertainment for you all." Everyone clapped politely. Curious, Elena smiled and said, "Yes, a performance, a musical one." She turned toward Daniel, and all eyes followed. Howard frowned, confused. "Wait, him?" he asked, laughing awkwardly. "You mean the caretaker?" She nodded. "Yes, the caretaker, but not as you think." Whispers spread through the room like a wave. Guests exchanged puzzled looks. Daniel felt his throat tighten. His palms sweaty, he wanted to disappear, but something in Elena's voice anchored him. "Daniel," she said softly, "it's time." He stood frozen for a moment, then took a deep breath and stepped toward the piano, each step echoing in the silence. The same piano that had mocked him yesterday now waited for him like an old friend. Howard chuckled, shaking his head. "This should be good," he whispered to a guest beside him. "If he can play even one decent note, I'll double his salary." But as Daniel sat down, something changed in the air. His hands hovered over the keys. The lights glimmered off the polished surface, and then he began to play. The first note silenced every voice in the room. It was soft but powerful, alive with emotion, and the second note followed like a heartbeat. Soon the entire hall was filled with sound, not noise, not performance, but emotion so pure it felt sacred. The melody rose and fell like waves, sometimes whispering, sometimes roaring. Daniel forgot the crowd, forgot Howard, forgot his fear. It was just him and the piano, the music flowing through him like blood. Howard's smile slowly faded. His glass lowered, his jaw tightened. Something inside him twisted as he listened, because what he heard wasn't just good, it was extraordinary, and it came from a man he had mocked. The guests were motionless, some with tears in their eyes, others leaning forward as if afraid to breathe too loudly. The music ended with a final soft note that seemed to linger in the air, long after his hands stopped moving. Then there was silence, heavy, complete, and then, suddenly applause exploded, thunderous and real. People stood from their chairs, shouting, "Bravo!" Over and over, Howard sat frozen, unable to speak. Elena smiled. Tears in her eyes, she whispered, "Now they know." Daniel stood up slowly, confused, trembling, overwhelmed by the sound of people clapping for him. For the first time in years, he felt alive again. Howard finally rose to his feet, his face pale, his voice quiet. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, almost whispering. Daniel looked at him with calm eyes and said, From someone who taught me that music doesn't care who you are. It only listens to your heart. The words cut through the room like truth itself. Howard couldn't reply. The crowd continued clapping. And Daniel realized that for the first time, the mansion wasn't laughing at him, it was listening. The mansion was never the same after that night. The sound of Daniel's performance still echoed through every hallway. Every guest who had been there spoke about it for days. The newspapers even mentioned a mysterious pianist who played in a millionaire's home. And the story spread faster than Howard could stop it. Yet Daniel, the quiet caretaker, went back to polishing the same marble floors the next morning. His face calm, his movements humble as if nothing had happened. But inside him, everything had changed. A part of him that had been asleep for years was finally awake. Elena, however, was not done. She knew that kind of talent couldn't stay hidden forever. She visited the mansion again, this time not as a guest but with purpose in her eyes. She found Daniel cleaning near the piano and smiled softly. "You can't keep doing this," she said. "You belong somewhere bigger." He looked up, surprised. "Bigger?" he asked quietly. "Elena, I'm just a caretaker. No one will care about my music," but she shook her head firmly. "You're wrong, they already do." Before Daniel could respond, Howard entered the room, his usual confidence missing, his expression mixed with pride and guilt. He walked toward Daniel slowly, clearing his throat. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words sounding heavy. "I mocked you. I insulted you in front of everyone, and yet you showed me something I'll never forget." Daniel didn't know what to say. He simply nodded respectfully, but Howard wasn't finished. "I want to make it right," he said. "I own a concert hall in the city, one of the best, and if you'll allow me, I want you to play there, properly for the world to see." Daniel froze. His broom slipping from his hand, he blinked, unsure if he heard right. "Play? On stage?" he whispered. Howard nodded. "Yes, as a professional." Elena's smile grew wide, her eyes shining. "See?" she said softly. "The world is ready for you." But Daniel shook his head. Stepping back, "No, I can't," he said quickly. "I'm not ready. I'm not good enough for that." Howard frowned. "You think what you did here was small?" he asked. "That was genius, pure emotion. People would pay to hear you again." Daniel's voice trembled. "I haven't touched a piano in years until that night. I don't even have proper clothes. I don't belong in a concert hall." Elena stepped closer, her tone gentle. "You don't need fancy clothes to show your soul." "Daniel," she said, "all you need is courage." For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. The air felt thick with possibility. Finally, he sighed. "Let me think about it," he said quietly. "All my life I've worked for others. Maybe I'm afraid of working for myself." Elena smiled faintly. "Then let me help you," she said. "We'll do it together." That evening, Daniel went home to his small apartment above the maintenance shed behind the mansion. He sat on his narrow bed and stared at his hands. The same hands that once played music for his mother. He whispered, "What would you say, Mom?" He looked at the old picture on his bedside table, his mother smiling beside her piano. He could almost hear her laugh. "I'd say stop doubting and start playing," he murmured. And something in him finally shifted the next day. He met Howard and Elena in the mansion's study. "I'll do it," he said softly. "I'll play. But not for money, not for fame, for her." He pointed toward the small photograph he carried of his mother. Howard nodded respectfully. "Then you'll play for all of us," he said. "I'll arrange everything, the stage, the instruments, the promotion," Elena added. "And I'll be there to make sure you believe in yourself every step of the way." Days passed in quiet preparation. Howard used his influence to book the city's grand concert hall. Invitations were sent to critics, musicians, and journalists. Everyone was curious to see the caretaker pianist, as the newspapers now called him. Daniel practiced day and night in the mansion, his fingers finding strength and grace again. Each melody he played grew deeper, more emotional, more alive. Sometimes Elena would sit nearby, eyes closed, just listening. And every time she did, Daniel played even better. The night of the concert arrived. The grand hall was full, chandeliers shone, the air buzzed with excitement, people whispered. Wondering if the rumors were true, Howard sat in the front row beside Elena, both watching the stage with nervous pride. And behind the curtain, Daniel stood quietly, his heart pounding like a drum. He wore a simple black suit. Nothing fancy, but he looked calm, centered, real. A man from the staff whispered, "You're up." Daniel nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the stage. The lights blinded him for a moment, but then he saw them. hundreds of faces waiting, and suddenly he wasn't afraid anymore. He walked to the piano, sat down and placed his fingers on the keys. The hall fell silent, not a single whisper, and then he began to play. The first notes flowed like silk, soft and emotional, then grew powerful. Rising through the hall like a storm of light, people gasped, some even cried. The music carried every part of his story, his struggles, his pain, his mother's love, and the laughter that once humiliated him. It was all there, transformed into something beautiful. By the time he played the final note, the hall was trembling with applause. People rose to their feet, shouting his name, tears on their faces. Howard clapped the loudest, his eyes shining with pride and regret. Elena's smile was bright and full of joy, and Daniel bowed deeply, his heart full for the first time in his life. He wasn't just a caretaker anymore. He was a musician again, and the world finally heard his voice. The applause roared like thunder, wave after wave crashing through the grand concert hall. Daniel stood there frozen, blinking against the bright lights. He had dreamed of this once long ago, when life still felt kind, when his mother's laughter filled the air. But now it was real. It wasn't a dream anymore. His heart trembled, his eyes glistened. People were on their feet shouting his name. Daniel. Daniel? He bowed slowly, humbled, overwhelmed. Elena stood from her seat, her hands shaking as she clapped, pride glowing in her eyes. She had believed in him when no one else did. Howard, too, was clapping, but his face was a strange mix of pride and guilt. Maybe because deep inside, he knew this moment wasn't his creation. It was his redemption. The man he once mocked had turned his own concert hall into a cathedral of emotion. As Daniel walked backstage, his legs felt weak. The staff cheered quietly. A few even patted his shoulder. "You did it," one whispered, but Daniel only smiled softly. "We did it," he said, his voice gentle, all of us behind him. The echoes of his last song still lingered, haunting and beautiful, a sound that would stay in the minds of everyone who heard it that night. Back in the main hall, reporters crowded around Howard and Elena. Microphones flashing, one of them asked, "Who is this man? Where did he come from?" Howard cleared his throat. "He's the caretaker of my mansion," the crowd gasped. The reporter blinked. "A caretaker?" Howard nodded. "Yes, but tonight he showed that greatness doesn't need a title, just a soul." It was perhaps the most honest thing he had ever said. Later that night, after the crowd had gone, Daniel returned to the empty stage, the lights dim, the air thick with the memory of music. He sat down again, alone this time, his fingers brushing over the keys softly. "Mom," he whispered, "I finally did it." He closed his eyes and played one quiet song just for her. No audience, no noise, just him and the piano and the feeling of peace he hadn't felt in years. Suddenly, a soft voice came from behind. "You played beautifully." It was Elena walking slowly down the aisle, her heels clicking softly on the wooden floor. Daniel smiled shyly. "You shouldn't have stayed," he said. "It's late," she smiled. "How could I leave after hearing something like that?" She sat beside him on the piano bench, the faint glow from the stage lights reflected in her eyes. "Do you realize what you've done?" she asked softly. "You made everyone believe again, not in wealth, not in fame, but in art and truth." Daniel laughed quietly, shaking his head. "I only played," and he said, "You gave me the courage to do it." She looked at him for a long moment, then whispered, "Sometimes it takes one brave heart to wake another." They sat there in silence, the air warm and calm, Daniel's hand still resting on the piano, her hand resting gently over his, not as a gesture of romance, but as a silent thank you between two souls who understood each other. Meanwhile, outside the hall, Howard stood alone by his car, looking back through the glass doors at the man he once humiliated. He sighed deeply, for the first time feeling the weight of his arrogance. "He made my name famous tonight," he whispered to himself. "But he did it with humility I never had." A driver opened the door for him, but he shook his head, choosing instead to walk home under the cold night sky, perhaps hoping the wind might wash away a little of his shame. The morning sun poured through the tall glass windows of the mansion, now alive with music and laughter. The golden rays touched every corner of the grand hall that once stood silent and proud. Where arrogance had once echoed, now there was harmony. Children's voices mixed with the sound of pianos, violins, and flutes. The mansion had become something new. Not a monument to one man's wealth, but a living heart that beat with dreams. Daniel stood near the stage watching a group of students rehearse, small fingers moving carefully across piano keys. One of them hesitated, missing a note. Daniel smiled gently, walked over, and knelt beside him. "Don't be afraid of mistakes," he said softly. "Music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest." The boy looked up and nodded shyly. Daniel guided his hand back to the right key, and the melody began again. This time more confident, more alive as he stood. Elena walked into the hall holding a stack of invitations. "Guess what?" she said, smiling. "We've been asked to perform at the city's winter festival. They want the students to open the show." Daniel raised an eyebrow, amused. "Our students? The same ones who argue over who gets the good piano?" She laughed. "The very same, but they're ready and you're going to conduct." He shook his head playfully. "Me? Conducting? That's a first," but her expression told him she wasn't joking. "You're the soul of this academy, Daniel, and it's time people see what you've built." Later that evening, after the students left, Daniel wandered through the empty halls. His footsteps soft on the marble floor. The walls were lined with framed photographs, students performing, laughing, learning, and one large portrait at the center, showing him at the piano, surrounded by smiling children. Under it was a brass plate that read, "Daniel Cross and the caretaker who taught the world to feel." He stopped for a moment, staring at it, his throat tightening. He never liked being celebrated, but this felt different. It wasn't about fame or applause, it was about legacy, about passing forward what had once been given to him by his mother. He whispered under his breath, "If only you could see this, Mom." And as if the mansion itself heard him, a soft breeze moved through the open window, rustling the curtains like a sigh. The night of the winter festival arrived. The city glowed with silver lights and snowflakes drifting like feathers. The concert hall was packed. Hundreds of people filled the seats, waiting eagerly. Backstage, Daniel's students buzzed with nervous excitement, some trembling, some whispering prayers. Daniel stood among them, calm and reassuring. "Remember," he said, smiling, "you're not here to impress, you're here to share. Let your hearts speak." When the curtain lifted, the children walked onto the stage, their instruments shining under the lights. Daniel stepped up to the conductor's podium, his simple black suit blending with the shadows, but his presence filled the room. He lifted his hand and silence fell. Then, with a graceful motion, the music began. Soft, sweet, and full of life. The melody was his own composition, built from fragments of the song he had played the night he was humiliated. But this time, it wasn't sorrowful, it was triumphant, bright and free. The audience listened, enchanted, their eyes wide. Their hearts moved. Halfway through, snow began to fall gently outside the windows, as if the world itself had joined in the performance. In the front row, Elena watched with pride, tears shining in her eyes. Beside her, Howard sat quietly, his cane resting against the seat. He was older now, slower, but the warmth in his eyes was clear. He whispered to her, "He saved me, you know." Elena nodded softly. "He saved all of us." Howard smiled faintly. "He gave this house a soul." When the final note faded, the applause erupted like thunder. People stood cheering, clapping, shouting Daniel's name. The children beamed with pride, and Daniel turned to them, bowing deeply with tears in his eyes. He had seen every face, every soul, light up because of music, and that was more reward than any wealth could ever offer. After the concert, as the hall emptied, Daniel stayed behind again, standing by the piano on stage. The same way he had done years ago, he touched the keys gently, his reflection faint in the polished surface. Elena approached, her voice soft. "You did it again." He smiled. "We did," he said. "You, me, them. Even Howard," she chuckled. "And your mother?" Daniel nodded. "She's here too, every time I play." They stood there in silence, the city lights glowing through the tall windows, snow falling endlessly beyond the glass. Daniel pressed one final note, soft and warm, and said quietly, "Music is like life. It fades, but it leaves something behind." Elena smiled. "A melody," she said. "A memory." He nodded. "A reason to keep going." And as the lights dimmed, the mansion, once a place of vanity, stood proud again, not because of wealth or reputation, but because one humble caretaker had turned it into a sanctuary of music, hope, and forgiveness. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the world in white silence, and from inside, faint music drifted into the night, carried by the wind, a melody that would never be forgotten. The song of a man who once swept floors but ended up sweeping hearts. Days passed and Daniel's name began to spread. Newspapers printed his story with headlines like, From janitor to genius and the caretaker who played for the soul of the city, people came to the mansion just to see where he once worked. Howard's business flourished again, not because of money, but because of the story behind it. Everyone wanted to hear the pianist who played truth instead of notes, but Daniel didn't change. He still lived in his small apartment behind the mansion, still watered the plants and swept the corridors, except now, every morning, he played for a few minutes before work. Not for anyone else, just for himself. Elena often visited with sheet music and coffee, helping him plan small performances for schools and hospitals. He wanted to play for people who had forgotten hope, people like he once was. One afternoon, a small boy from the cleaning staff came to him shyly, holding a notebook. "Sir, can you teach me?" the boy asked. Daniel smiled, remembering himself as a child with wide eyes and dreams too big for the world. "Of course," he said gently. "Let's begin." And together they sat at the piano, his old fingers guiding small ones, showing the next heart how to speak through music. That night, as the mansion grew quiet again, Daniel stood by the window looking at the city lights. He whispered softly, "It's strange, the things we run from are often the things that save us." He smiled faintly, turning back to the piano, his reflection shimmering on its polished surface. The same piano that once symbolized humiliation now stood as a symbol of redemption. Every key holding a story, every note carrying forgiveness. He sat down, placed his fingers gently on the keys, and began to play again, not for applause, not for fame, but because the music was finally free. And so was he. The days that followed turned into weeks, and Daniel's name spread like a quiet fire across the city. Posters with his face appeared outside concert halls, cafes, and radio stations. But the world didn't call him Mr. Daniel or the great pianist. They called him the caretaker of music, because that's what he was. A man who had kept something pure alive inside him when the world had forgotten it, and people loved him for it. One afternoon, Daniel sat by the piano in the mansion again, sunlight falling across the keys, his fingers tracing soft melodies. Elena walked in holding a newspaper. "You're on the front page again," she said, smiling proudly. Daniel chuckled. "I didn't think people liked quiet stories anymore." She shook her head. "They like truth, Daniel, and your story is full of it." She placed the paper on the piano. The headline read, "From Silence to Symphony, the man who reminded the world to feel." Daniel's eyes softened, but he said quietly, "You know, I never wanted fame." She nodded. "I know. That's why you deserve it." He smiled faintly and played another few notes. Gentle as breath, the sound drifted through the mansion like memory. But just then, Howard entered the hall, his voice unusually soft. "Daniel, may I have a word?" Elena stepped aside as Howard approached, his eyes heavy but sincere. "I've been thinking," he began. "When you played that night, something changed in me. I realized how empty my life had been, filled with gold, but not a single note of meaning." Daniel looked at him curiously, saying nothing. "So I want to make it right," Howard continued. "This mansion doesn't deserve to be just a house for parties. It should be a place for music for people like you." Daniel blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "You mean?" Howard nodded. "I want to turn it into a music academy," he said. "And I want you to lead it." The words hung in the air, heavy with disbelief. Elena's eyes widened with joy. "That's a beautiful idea," she whispered. Howard smiled faintly. "No, it's overdue." Daniel looked down at the keys, his reflection shimmering in the piano surface. "Me," he said softly. "You trust me to lead something like that?" Howard placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've already been leading people." "Daniel, you just didn't know it." For the first time, there was no arrogance in Howard's tone, only respect. Daniel smiled slowly, humbled. "If this can give others what music gave me," he said, "then I'll do it." And so the transformation began. The mansion that once echoed with shallow laughter, now filled with the sound of instruments and young voices. The grand halls became classrooms. The dining room turned into a rehearsal space. And Daniel, once a caretaker with a broom, now guided students with the same gentleness his mother once gave him. He taught them not how to play perfectly, but how to play truthfully. "Don't chase notes," he told them. "Chase emotion." One afternoon, as Daniel walked through the hall, he stopped by the same spot where Howard had mocked him months ago. The memory felt distant now, almost unreal. He smiled faintly. The sound of laughter filled the air again. But this time, it wasn't cruel. It was joyful. Students laughing, instruments tuning. A world reborn from the ashes of pride. Elena visited often. Helping organize events and student showcases, she and Daniel became partners in building something beautiful. Sometimes when the day ended, she would sit by him at the piano and they would play soft duets, wordless conversations made of harmony. The other staff would pause to listen, smiling quietly before returning to work. The mansion was finally alive in the right way. Howard, though, remained a quieter man now. He often stood at the back during student performances, clapping softly, his eyes distant like a man trying to make peace with himself. One evening, after a small concert, he approached Daniel. "You've done more with this house in months than I did in years," he said. Daniel smiled warmly. "You gave it a second chance, just like you gave me." Howard nodded, eyes glistening. Maybe we both needed to be humbled first. Later that night, Daniel sat alone at the piano again, the hall silent, the moonlight pouring through the tall windows. He began to play the same melody he had played the first night, the one that had changed everything. But now it sounded different, softer, freer, as if each note carried gratitude instead of sorrow. He looked up at the portrait of his mother that Elena had hung above the stage, and whispered, "We did it, Mom." As the last note faded, he closed his eyes, breathing deeply. He didn't need applause anymore. He didn't need the world's attention. The true reward was right there, in the laughter of children learning, in the peace of music filling the air, in the kindness he had found after pain. The mansion that once symbolized arrogance had become a temple of harmony. And as Daniel rose from the piano, he looked around at the lights, the empty seats, and the walls that now held the echoes of dreams, and he smiled, because he knew he had not only restored music to the world, he had restored humanity to it, and tomorrow, when new students would walk through those doors, he would welcome them not as a caretaker, not as a pianist, but as someone who finally understood the meaning of every note. Forgiveness, hope, and rebirth.